Welcome back, AP. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our continuing discussion of that crazy revolution that we got on our hands right now, right? That French Revolution, that croissant of revolutions, that really intense revolution that's going to be way more violent, way more intense than the American one, right? But give me about 2 seconds. I'm going to clip in something real fast where I'm going to explain the aftermath of the night of August the 4th, right? So we talked about in class, right, or left off in class, talking about the night of August the 4th, which is going to be a very seminal event that's going to be very, very important that I think y'all should really go back, circle it in your notes, highlight it or something. I can definitely see Emma Rogers doing something like that right now. Big thing about it, though, is that night of August the 4th is going to be the official movement or moment in European history where a country finally decides to outlaw feudalism, right? And August 4th, 1789 is going to begin a trend or a wave where other European countries are going to also begin to outlaw feudalism. Interesting thing about it is England never outlawed feudalism. It kind of just phased out because the Industrial Revolution kind of replaced it. But the big thing about it, though, is going into it, something that we need to understand is that in 1789, when that thing goes down, August the 4th, when all the nobles get paraded into the actual meeting hall where they had to sign over all of their land and titles and the nobility is abolished, right? It's a really big moment, right? But immediately after that, a new document's going to come out, which is going to set down everybody's rights, right? And that's what I'm about to clip in real fast is me talking about the Declaration of the Rights of Man, a document written by Thomas Jefferson and the Marquis de Lafayette and this other guy named Maximilian Robespierre that I'm going to talk about here in a couple seconds, okay? But I'll see you in a second. But now everyone is considered to be more equal, in a sense. Now, at the August Decrees, another big event is going to start going down. And they are going to actually call up a very famous figure, right? A man by the name of Thomas Jefferson. And they invite him to come to France. And Marquis de Lafayette and Thomas Jefferson begin working on a document in August, right after they outlawed feudalism. And that document is going to change the trajectory of French history forever, as well as change the trajectory of European history forever. And the document that these two individuals co-wrote with one another is known as, first of all, it came out August 27th, 1789, and it is known as the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. I swear on everything holy, I love the name of this document, the Declaration of the Rights of Man. It sounds like a heavy metal album that Mr. Roddy would definitely play accompaniment on his ukulele. You know what I'm talking about? So the big thing about it is it sounds like such a cool document, but then and of the Citizen comes in and it just kind of ruins it for me. So if you always need to remember, it's just the Declaration of the Rights of Man. You could totally call it that all you want to, but it is also known as the Dormoch or the Dorm, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. But the document is still very, very important, okay? The document comes out written in part by Thomas Jefferson and Marquis de Lafayette, and it actually symbolizes and embolizes a lot of the same values that are actually put forward in the Constitution of the United States and the Bill of Rights. What it is it is a document that includes a preamble and that it begins to lay out all of the Enlightenment-inspired ideas and rights that every single person is entitled to in this entire new French area, right? So, now that the Ancient Regime is dead, this document is meant to come along and tell every single person the rights that they are entitled to, the rights that they were born with, and the rights of which they deserve, right? Now, the thing about it is we do have an ideological split in this thing, okay? You got a little bit of a difference between this document and you have a difference of the document in the United States of America, right? Well, a lot of that is because the document in the United States, or the Constitution and the Bill of Rights in the United States of America, which outline the government and then also set up the rights of the people in the United States, are going to be written primarily by Jefferson and the founding fathers of the United States, and they're going to have the same kind of ideological ideas in them, right? The ideas of life, liberty, and property, or life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Direct Enlightenment-inspired ideas. But most of these ideas are going to be pulled from John Locke, Baron de Montesquieu, an anti-Hobbesian view of a monarchy, right? Now, the thing about it, when we look at it, though, is France is a little bit different, okay? France is going to also have some other Enlightenment thinker ideas that came in a little bit later during and after the American Revolution, and Rousseau's ideas are going to make their way into this document. Louis now in this document is going to be known as the King of the French, rather than being known as the King of France. Now, this is really, really important because it's basically setting him up as a monarchy that will be a monarch over the people, not over the lands and the property that the people therein by own, right? So this is a really big moment. Also, it's an ideological split as well because Jefferson would have gotten rid of this monarch, whereas they never actually did. Louis is still considered the king, and it laid down the new rights under the new regime of France. And one of the three biggest things that you are now allowed to have is freedom of speech, freedom of property, and another big one is the general will, okay? I need you to write that down somewhere on this note, is that in this document, the ideas of the general will are outlined, right? And the ideas of Rousseau coming in and volleying for direct democracy and a representative body of people that will directly dictate law and order is going to be coming into play. Now, it's very important that we understand that the general will can get kind of crazy a little bit at times, because at one point, the general will kind of always says, well, the majority rules. Well, sometimes the majority is really stupid and violent and aggressive and angry, kind of like looking into the fascist regimes of the 1940s in Europe, and then also looking at the reign of terror, which is coming down the pipe, because a lot of people supported it at that time, but now we look back on it and we're like, that's a borderline genocide, right? So the thing about it, though, in general, is that we're seeing something happening right now, and power is being split and changed dramatically in France, right? So in this essence, like, we're looking at, like, the ideas of France, and we now have three groups of people that are beginning to pop up. Now, these groups of people believe in three different specific areas. You got conservatives, which are people like Louis and the nobles and monarchs in general. Classical liberals, which are more like Thomas Jefferson, and then you've got proto-socialists, which is like Rousseau, right? So what we're trying to do right now is we're trying to basically just take 2 seconds to discuss, where does power belong according to each of these individuals, right? And why is this document so important is because it's setting up that power dynamic. Well, the thing about it is I couldn't find any other good little emoji for power other than this rainbow that I found on Prezi. So just to show you, in the long run, conservatives, like Louis, believe that the power should still lie in the ruling class, in the nobles, and in the wealthy of France. Whereas classical liberals, like Thomas Jefferson, believe it should be a split power between upper-class citizens, the bourgeois, and the rest of the people as well. Something right smack in the middle, more dictated by business and economics, and also of less of feudal rights and things like that, somewhere in the middle. Whereas the socialists, or proto-socialists, like Rousseau, believe that power should lie completely in the hands of the people with direct democracy aspects, right? Now, but yeah, so that document right there is super wicked important, right? Understanding where the power lies within the people, right? And the understanding the concept that, of course, like, conservatives are going to want it to be with absolutists. Classical liberals are going to want to be right there in the middle with that Declaration of the Rights of Man, because you'll notice in the Declaration of the Rights of Man, it never got rid of Louis. It just changed him from the King of France to the King of the French, right? Okay, like, now, big thing about that we need to understand, though, as well, is we've got some other players on the rise, right? So in this entire storyline, in this entire story construct, we're going to have people rising and falling throughout this entire story. And sometimes Mr. Terry does tend to forget to give you a wrap-up on some of them, right? Telling you, like, what happened to a few of them and things like that. But let's take a quick mental recount of the people that we already know. We know Marie Antoinette, right? We know King Louis XVI. We know the Marquis de Lafayette. We know Jacques Necker, right? The guy that almost got, like, dismissed and it actually led to the storming of the Bastille. Now, there's a couple other guys I'm about to talk about right now that are going to become major players as well. But if you at any point feel like you didn't get enough or don't know enough about a certain person, just ask me in class. Be like, wait, what happened to the Marquis de Lafayette? Wait, why do the people of France hate Marie Antoinette so much again? Like, little stuff like that, just let me know. But we got two other guys that during this early liberal phase / moderate phase of the revolution are going to rise up through the ranks and really begin to demonstrate themselves as key players, right? Now, one of them is a very, very famous young man who was a lawyer by trade and also was elected to the Estates General and began to make him a name for himself as a very powerful orator, right? He would give fiery speeches that were super intense, where he said that he would never abandon the cause of the people and that he would actually make sure that the Declaration of the Rights of Man got signed and that the people of France were looked out for first. And his name was Maximilien Robespierre, right? Now go ahead and write that down. Maximilien Robespierre, right? Robespierre, okay? Maximilien Robespierre is going to be phenomenally important because he's also going to help write the Declaration of the Rights of Man. And he's going to be a major voice in the entire National Assembly as they're beginning to change a lot of things, right? He is very much so making sure that there's no moderation towards the wealthy, right? That we're making sure that the poor are being taken care of. And another thing that we need to understand about Maximilien Robespierre is he's showing a little bit of a twinge towards violence, right? He's showing a little bit of an understanding of the poor, right? He's beginning to demonstrate that he actually kind of likes a little bit of blood in the streets, right? So something that we need to get about him, though, is he's going to become very, very important later on, right? Especially when he feels that the National Assembly is not getting the job done, and he's going to start himself a little club called the Jacobins, right? Well, he's not going to start it, but he's going to be a member of it, and he's going to be a leading member of it, right? Now, the big thing about it, though, is he is very much there. He is also showing himself a little bit as somebody that doesn't really necessarily agree with the Marquis de de Lafayette's temperate approach to fixing all of these problems, right? Because he's like, how can we listen to a noble who doesn't get the problems of the third estate, right? So the big thing about the Marquis de Lafayette and the Maximilien Robespierre debates, they will come up a little bit later on, but you need to understand something else about this guy right here, who's a very good friend of Maximilien Robespierre, and they understand each other very, very well. This guy right here is none other than a famous man by the name of Jean-Paul Marat, right? Like so, Jean-Paul Marat spelled Jean space Paul space Marat is spelled Marat, okay? Now, Jean-Paul Marat, who was actually a very famous individual who had a lot of different careers throughout his life, and a bunch of them kind of failed and stuff like that, actually one day finds his calling, right? And Jean-Paul Marat is a newspaper writer, right? And while Maximilien Robespierre and the Marquis de Lafayette are dealing with all of this different stuff, right, one of the biggest things that they come out with is they want to release the muzzle on the freedom of the press, right? They want to release the muzzle on the people who can write newspaper and stuff like that, and Jean-Paul Marat is one of those newspaper writers, okay? Jean-Paul Marat was very, very famous for writing this particular newspaper called La Ému des Peuples. I can't really say it in French, but it means the friend of the people, right? And so his was one of the newspapers that began to circulate really, really heavily when Maximilien Robespierre and when the Marquis de Lafayette began to lift a lot of that censorship on the press and stuff like that, okay? So when we're looking at this, though, funny enough, Jean-Paul Marat was such an adamant writer that he made fun of the royals even before the revolution started. He was really stirring the pot before everything even went down, so much so that he had to actually go into hiding at one point of his life. Y'all, he hid in the sewers of Paris, right? Down in the sewers that's going to give him a skin disease later in life that he is very painful and itchy and stuff like that, and literally it's like a form of cirrhosis that he would have to sit in a medical bath for hours a day. But the big thing about the Friend of the People newspaper that he wrote, he loved to stir that pot, he loved to spread rumors, and he loved to galvanize the poor in a really big way. Well, after the storming of the Bastille, on actually July 14th, 1789, right? And then you're going to have the August decrees, right? Then you're going to have the Great Fear, and you're going to have a lot of different stuff going down throughout the several months of the Revolution. Well, things are beginning to calm down a little bit, going into the later areas of the fall and going into early winter, right? In October, though, there's going to be a rumor that begins to circulate around Paris, y'all, and it's a big one that Jean-Paul Marat wrote all about, right? He wrote about it in an inflammatory article being like, I cannot believe that the royals are still back in Versailles doing all this. And he wrote a story about how he had heard a rumor that Louis is hiding in Versailles right now, 13 miles outside of Paris, sitting there twiddling his thumbs, having big parties, eating all this food, not wasting a scrap of it, having all of his people being well-fed, happy, and healthy, and then also he's making fun of the revolution from there, right? Jean-Paul Marat claims that he heard that Louis ripped a tricolor cockade, right? That little pin that people would wear, the little bullseye-looking pin that people would wear, which at the time was actually only red and white, or red and blue, but don't get me started. But the big thing about it, though, is when we're looking at it, he apparently ripped it off somebody's chest, threw it down on the ground, and began to stomp on it and stuff like that, because he was so anti-revolution. Now, the thing about it is Jean-Paul Marat writes about this story, and it, y'all, makes people livid, makes people so upset, but it makes one group of people more upset, particularly more than anybody else. And apparently that group that had made more upset than anybody else was not the working men of Paris. It wasn't the sewer and dock workers of Paris. It wasn't these brawny men that we saw actually going off and storming the Bastille. No, y'all, ladies, it made the women of Paris more furious than anybody else, right? Now, a lot of historians debate as to why this article and why this rumor really enraged the women, the working women of Paris in particular. But I personally believe, if I'm reading some different accounts of it and reading Simon Schama's book, Citizens, and stuff like that, that it actually, I agree with Schama in a big way. The women were the ones who had been working constantly, especially the working dock workers of Paris, right? These women that apparently made up the core of the entire group were these women known as the Poissardes, right? And the Poissardes are these women right here, who are also known as the fishmongering women, right? They literally worked on the docks, and they would lift huge crates of fish, all the time. So they were just muscular as all get out and super strong and stuff like that. And also they carried knives with them all the time that were for scaling and gutting fish, right? The thing about it is these women were the ones that made up the core of a band of women that showed up in front of the Marquis de Lafayette with copies of La Ému des Peuples, and were just like, hey, What the heck is I see about this? Not that he's stomping on a cockade, not that he's going against the revolution, but that he's eating well, and that he's also not having to pay for all that bread, right? So these women were actually more enraged that they were actually having nights where they couldn't feed their own kids, but the king is living fat and happy, right? So on October 5th, 1789, a massive mob of women went up to the Marquis de Lafayette and said, "Will you go with us to Versailles?" And the Marquis de Lafayette tried to get him to calm down, right? Tried to get him to calm down and be like, "Hey, we don't need to do all that." And the women were like, "We demand weapons, we demand cannons," and they took all of it, right? The women literally grabbed guns, and they grabbed cannons, and they grabbed pikes, and knives, and swords, and things like that, and they marched, y'all, 13 miles, or 6 hours to Versailles in the rain, and on the way, and to try and go up to Versailles to gut the people their flour, right? To get the flour and the bread out of the inside of Versailles and to bring it back to Paris with them, right? And they showed up out front of that gate of Versailles, right? They showed up out in front of this very gate right here out front of Versailles, which, interesting little fact about this, that's the second one, right? That's the second one because these women are not only going to show up and get angry, y'all, they apparently had a lot of little things go on when they actually arrived there finally. Apparently also it was one group of women that was like walking, being like, "I'm gonna go get some bread for my babies," right? And then literally they were like, look to the right and there was a fork in the road, and then another group of women like were also marching, and they were like, "Oh, Cheryl," and they like bonded and were like, "Oh my god, I haven't seen you in years," and then literally the group of women like doubled in like 2 seconds. The thing about it though is they marched that 6 hours all the way to Versailles, y'all, all the way there, dragging cannons with them, and when they got to the gate, apparently they met with Louis. A couple of the leaders of the mob like met with Louis, and Louis apparently was charming for like the first time in his life. It was like, "Oh, let me get the bread for you, blah blah blah." A woman said that he was so charming that she fainted, and then like, and that big thing about though that ends up happening though is they actually believe though that their aggression was not being met, and instead of blaming Louis now, they actually blamed Marie Antoinette because she's got kids too, right? And so the thing, and she didn't look out for the women of Paris. So apparently they ripped that gate down to the ground. They stormed into Versailles. They went running through the hallways trying to get Marie Antoinette, and they wanted to kill her, right? They wanted to kill her so bad. When they were storming into Versailles, they actually killed 2 guards on the way in, cut their heads off, stuck them on pikes, and were chasing her through Versailles with these heads on sticks, right? She runs into Louis' like room, gets inside there, doesn't know what to do, and then Louis sends her out onto a balcony to talk to the women. The women then begin to load their guns, right, and point their guns at Marie Antoinette until the Marquis de Lafayette actually rolls up there and says, "Ladies, please," and all the ladies were like, "What you got to say?" So yeah, he goes up there and he kisses Marie Antoinette's hand. He says, "Long live the queen," right? And the women were like, "Fine," right? And they put their guns away. But the biggest thing about this entire event, that the Marquis de Lafayette did save Marie Antoinette from death in that moment, right? That literally, a lot of people say it's because the Marquis de Lafayette was like handsome and charming and stuff like that, but I think that's not giving all these women enough credit, right? Like I said, now look, big thing about it though is the Marquis de Lafayette saves Marie Antoinette, right? But the big thing about it though is what's going to happen next. The women then tell the Marquis de Lafayette, "Fine, okay, we get it, that's fine. We'll leave them alive, but we refuse to return to Paris without them." And that is the ultimate biggest effect of this event, y'all. That the Women's March on Versailles, a group of women in this revolution, are going to make it so that the royals move back to Paris, right? That they go the 6 hours back with them to Paris in their royal carriage with the 2 heads of the decapitated guards up front of everybody else as they march their way back to Paris in the rain, right? The thing about it though, that literally this massive effect is going to be huge because the royals are going to end up under house arrest, right? Once they get there, the National Assembly is going to begin to consolidate their power, and that is going to be the last time that the royals ever see Versailles, right? They never go back. They never go back and because they end up dead before that even actually can possibly happen. But the consolidation of power by the National Assembly begins from 1790 to 1791, in the later, like in January-ish of about 1790. They're going to begin to actually kind of like really root everything down, sign new documents, create new constitutions, give themselves new elected bodies and stuff like that, and they're going to place the royal family under house arrest in this palace right here, and it's known as the Tuileries. Tuilleries, the Tuileries, right? Like, so they place them under house arrest in the Tuileries, and what's going to end up happening is they're going to start taking and pillaging things from the French government so that they can solve the immediate financial crisis, right? And we'll talk about those things that they're going to do when we actually get back in class, because there's no way in heck that I'm going to explain the civil constitution of the clergy to you from 1790 that occurred in June of 1790, where they're going to basically eliminate the wealth of the First Estate. There's no way I'm going to explain it in about, I don't know, like 10 seconds, right? So we're going to go ahead and stop right there.